Trust that you will excuse the, shall we say, the detritus of VBS that's still hither and thither in the church building. It's quite a task, shall we say, to get everything picked up and put back. There we go. Much better. Now I can see what I need to see. We've been talking about reasons to believe, and this whole series of studies is based on the 3 little booklets that you'll find on the table out in the foyer that are entitled Believe the Bible. They're on the right-hand side of the table where the Back to the Bible personal study books are located. And these are booklets intended for use when you have the opportunity to sit down and talk to somebody who either doesn't believe in God, an atheist or an agnostic, or someone who's skeptical about the authenticity and the legitimacy and the authority of the Bible. Now, we've gone through the first couple of these little booklets, and we're in the last of the 3. And at this point in the course of the study, we kind of make the assumption that if this is still going on, the person that we're talking with has at least come to the point of accepting that God exists, or that it's logical to believe that, and that the Bible is not merely myth, but a trustworthy historical document. So, the evidence demonstrates that Jesus is a real person, and that he is someone, not was, but is someone we can know. Last week we talked about the idea that we can know that he existed, that he's a real person, based on written testimony. In other words, the Bible. The Word is a historical document. Whether skeptics and critics want to see it that way or not, the Bible is an historical document. And it should not be discounted out of hand simply because it advocates belief in God. It records facts of history. We also can know Jesus by faith. And we talked about the fact that biblical faith is not just a blind, uninformed, emotionally rooted choice, but rather it is a conviction based on objective evidence, based on fact. And faith should be based on evidence. It should not be a guess. Well, I guess there must be a God because I don't have a better explanation. No, that's not a reason to believe. That's not rational, that's not logical. But we ended up last week talking about knowing Jesus by his resurrection and by the evidences of that. And we had talked about the fact that the historical document we're looking at is a record that the tomb of Jesus was sealed, that by the standards of the day there was no way that his disciples could have stolen his body and put about a myth or a lie that he had resurrected, had been raised from the dead. We pointed out that the scripture records that the soldiers that were detailed to guard his tomb were bought off, were paid, and paid well, to say, well, the tomb was robbed. And that's where we left off. For what it's worth, I think I noted last week, that explanation has persisted into the 20th century. As one of my classmates in a college course, a very nice Jewish rabbi, or a Jewish veterinarian who'd consulted with his rabbi about this, very nice man said, well, this is the explanation. His disciples stole his body. And that, it's interesting that the Bible says that's what they've said, and that explanation has persisted into the 20th century at least. Take your Bible and turn to Mark chapter 16, and just notice in the first couple of verses there, as we read through this, Mark speaks to the circumstances of Jesus' resurrection. And he says, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Some of the women who knew him, who would have recognized him readily under normal circumstances, went to the tomb. They were there to, we would say, to embalm him, certainly to do some things that would actually hasten the desiccation, the drying up of the body, and mitigate the stench of rotting flesh somewhat. It's interesting, just a sort of a passing observation, it's interesting to notice that under normal circumstances, this was a job left to the women and not to the men under normal circumstances, because under Jewish law and custom, someone who handled the body of the deceased was going to be unclean until evening, until they had purified, washed, and the rest of the day they would be considered unclean. And in the culture of the time, the very male-dominated culture, well, it's better for a woman to be unclean than for a man to be unclean. So the women had to do this, typically. That's why these good ladies were coming to the tomb. Well, just continue on there in Mark chapter 16, and notice they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. Now verses 5 and 6. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Now, as we were talking about last week a little bit, the place where Jesus was buried was not a 4 foot wide by 8 foot long by 6 foot deep hole in the ground. We think of a grave in this Western culture in that way. The tomb where Jesus was laid, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb that had never been used before, was actually a cave, or what we would describe as a mausoleum, that had been cut out of the limestone cliff there outside the city of Jerusalem. It was a cavern or a room cut out of the stone, fitted with a door. In this case, the door was a large stone that could be rolled across the entrance. But inside the tomb, there would have been what we would think of as shelves on either side where a body could be laid. And the custom was that a body would be wrapped and embalmed or wrapped with these spices, and then it would be laid on one of these shelves. And in that somewhat arid climate, with the door closed, the stone rolled over it to prevent animals and things getting in, the body would be allowed to dry up, to desiccate. The flesh would deteriorate, and after a span of time, basically nothing but the bones would be left. And when the shelves of the mausoleum were all taken, then the driest of the bones would be taken and gathered up very respectfully, contained in an ossuary, or what we would think of as a bone box, and that would then be typically placed at the back of the tomb, the mausoleum room, so that that shelf would be available for someone else when they died. These ladies came to put the spices into the wrappings and so forth. And what did they discover? The tomb is open. It had been unsealed. The guards are gone. There's somebody in there. Now, previously, what had been in this tomb? Nothing but the body of Jesus. In fact, the record is very specific that this was a new tomb where never a man, never a person had been laid. It had never been used before. Brand new. Well, they don't find a body in there. They find a living person. And that person tells them he has risen. He has returned to life in this world. Testimony. A record of testimony. Now, what proof was offered? Verse 6. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. What proof did this individual offer? He's not here. There's no body here. No evidence of his death. Evidence of his resurrection. Flip over to Acts chapter 1. And in verse 3, as Jesus is dealing with his disciples, Dr. Luke records what? After his resurrection, he presented himself, or he showed himself alive after his suffering, after he'd been crucified. He showed himself alive by many proofs. We think about what Jesus did with the 11 after his resurrection. They're gathered together in one place. Thomas is not present, and he comes among them, the doors being shut. That's rather startling. How did he get in the room? Did he dematerialize and materialize? I don't know. If there's such a thing as a minor miracle, I suppose that would qualify. It was enough to startle them, suffice it to say. But Thomas was not there, so what does Jesus do the following week? Now he comes back in much the same manner. Thomas is there. Thomas, who had said, I will not believe in his resurrection until I see him and touch the scars in his hands, side, and so forth. And what does Jesus do? Look. Reach out and touch. See. Don't be faithless, but believe. Oh, well, that's just a myth. Is it? There is a written testimony that states, John 20, verses 30 and 31, that it was written for this purpose to serve as testimony, that should not be discounted or discredited simply because of what it says. That's the skeptic's number one objection. Oh, well, the Bible is not historical. It's a religious document. That's beside the point. It shouldn't be discounted simply because of that. It is a historical record. So, how long did Jesus show himself to his disciples and to others? Do you suppose the disciples were the only ones who saw him? Hardly. But Dr. Luke tells us here in verse 3, this went on for 6 weeks, 40 days. It would be one thing if the women came from the tomb and said, there was no body in the tomb, and there was a guy there saying that he'd risen from the dead, and that was all the evidence there is. That would constitute what the legal beagles describe as what? hearsay. So-and-so said, I heard so-and-so say this. That doesn't prove it. Now, they report back to the apostles, and Peter goes running to the tomb, bug-eyed, open-mouthed, slack-jawed. But even that, what's the confirmation that what those good ladies were told is true? Seeing the fact that Jesus showed himself, displayed himself to his disciples, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The Apostle Paul will eventually tell us that he appeared to more than 500 folks, more than 500 believers at one time. Oh, well, that's just mass hysteria. Really? You're going to try to make that case? Now, whom did Paul say saw Jesus after his resurrection? More than 500 people. And isn't it interesting that at the time Paul is writing the letter to the Corinthians, years after the fact, what does he also tell us? Not just that there were more than 500 people, but he also says at that point, most of them are still alive. In other words, look, you don't believe me? I can give you names. You can go check it out with them. Eyewitness testimony. Well, how are you going to disqualify that? He was buried. He rose again on the third day. He was seen by Peter. He was seen by the apostles. He was seen by more than 500 people at one time. How many witnesses do we have to have? Well, Jesus foretold his death by crucifixion repeatedly, several times to his disciples. And what else did he tell them about that? I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed into the hands of the rulers of the Jews. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be crucified and buried. And then what else did he tell them? I'm going to rise again on the third day. Matthew chapter 20, verses 17, 18, and 19. And you would think, or you might be excused for thinking, that these people, these disciples, the apostles, that third day would be wide-eyed, energetic, searching, scrambling around, looking everywhere for Jesus. Because what had he told them? I'm going to go to Jerusalem. Okay, we went to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Can we say Judas Iscariot? Exactly what he said was going to happen happened. One of their own number betrayed him into the hands of the rulers of the Jews. They tried him in a mockery of a trial, several trials actually, took him to the Romans, falsely accused him in order to secure a death sentence, which was a mockery of justice. Then he was taken and scourged, beaten within an inch of his life, just like he said would happen. And then what did they do with him? They took him out and crucified him. And Jesus not only said, I'm going to die, he specified how. Crucifixion. If they thought about it, he said, we're going to Jerusalem. We went to Jerusalem. He said he's going to be betrayed. He was betrayed. He said he'd be convicted, he was convicted. He said he'd be beaten, he was beaten. He said he'd be crucified and die, he was crucified and he died. Everything he said happened just like he said it, didn't it, Stan? You would think you'd be excused for thinking that these guys would just be wide-eyed scrambling around looking for him everywhere on that third day, because he said on the third day I'm going to rise. And what were they doing? They're moping around disheartened and brokenhearted, and Peter somewhere along the line says, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to fishing, as it were. Not I'm going to take a vacation, but I'm going back to what I used to do before I was a disciple of Jesus. And yet, here he is. You look at verses 18 and 19. We're going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests. They'll condemn him, deliver him to the Gentiles. He'll be mocked, scourged, crucified. Third day he'll rise again. Question: was the crucifixion and resurrection, were the crucifixion and resurrection attested by eyewitnesses? Absolutely. Peter, the 12, Thomas, the women, more than 500 at once, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6. We have the record of eyewitness testimony. Oh, well, that's the Bible. You shouldn't, that's. No, you don't discount a historical document just because of what it is, because it says something religious. That's not a legitimate reason to discount it. It remains an authentic historical document. Well, was the resurrection of Jesus attested, confirmed by multiple eyewitnesses? Absolutely. And we have the record of it. Was it confirmed by what the rulers of the Jews did, bribing the guards? Yeah. They didn't pay them off for guarding a tomb where they could say, well, look, there's the body right there. They paid them off to say, oh, well, his disciples stole his body. By the way, what's the normal military penalty for falling asleep on watch? Imprisonment at the least, and under normal circumstances it would be execution, at least in wartime. If anybody asks you about this, tell them that you are incompetent soldiers and got away with being incompetent. Really? We'll make it worth your while. Is the resurrection of Jesus confirmed by the lives and the deaths of his disciples? Now we get, in a sense, past the Bible as far as the skeptic or the unbeliever is concerned. How are you going to explain the commitment over a 2,000-year span of thousands upon thousands of believers who died for their faith? We're going to come back to mass hysteria? We're going to come back to just willful stupidity? That's the only reasonable response an unbeliever could offer, and that's really not very reasonable, is it? If he didn't arise from the dead, show me his body. The Roman Catholic denomination has made an enormous shrine out of what they claim is the tomb of Joseph. Whether it's accurately located or not, whether they've actually found the actual mausoleum that belonged to him or not, and there's debate back and forth amongst the archaeologists and the historians and whatnot. Various scholars say it was here, no, it was there, and so forth. Regardless, if he's still dead, show me his body, show me his tomb. Show me the ossuary that contains his bones. And if you haven't got it, you can't prove that he's still dead. Go ahead, Miss Denise. Do not include what? Mark 16, 9 through 2. Okay. Footnote in some of your Bibles that say earliest manuscripts, Greek manuscripts of the New Testament do not include Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. That's correct. Some of the earlier manuscripts do not. However, memory serves me, I believe that's Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, some of the earlier Greek manuscripts. However, what that doesn't tell you is, A, the same early manuscripts, and the idea is the earlier the manuscript, the farther back it goes, the more historically reliable it would be. A, those same manuscripts, many of them also do not include much or all of Revelation chapter 20. And yet, you will not find a copy of the Bible that has the same footnote under Revelation chapter 20 that says many of the earliest manuscripts do not contain, Revelation 20 verses 1 through whatever. Why not? Because, let's be frank about it, the theology of those who object to the content of Mark 16 verses 9 through 20 depends on their interpretation of Revelation chapter 20 for their belief in a 1,000-year rulership of Jesus on earth, which is a false doctrine in itself. But what's sauce for the goose, as they say, is sauce for the gander. So if Mark 16, 9 through 20 doesn't belong in the Bible because, these early manuscripts don't contain it, neither does Revelation chapter 20. But B, the other thing they don't tell you is that while it is true that some of the earliest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament do not contain Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20, even older translations, even older than those earliest Greek manuscripts, even older translations of Mark include those verses, which tells you what? Before those Greek manuscripts were produced, and remember, all we have are copies. We don't have the originals. We don't have the ones written by Mark with his own hand, as far as we know. But that tells you that when those translations were produced, Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20 were known, recognized, and accepted by the people making the copies and the translations. So the fact that some of the earliest Greek language manuscripts that we have available, the fact that they don't include those verses does not prove they don't belong in the Bible. What that proves is that those copies don't have them. That's all that proves. It does not impugn the textual authenticity of those verses. Okay, so come back here. Is the resurrection of Jesus confirmed by the presence of an empty tomb? Well, show me his body. Show me his bones. They're not there. Is there still an empty tomb? Absolutely. Well, very possibly. And yet there is no marker. The question was, wouldn't Joseph have used the tomb himself eventually? Very possibly. But there is no, this is the tomb of Jesus. These are the bones of Jesus. This is the ossuary, the burial box where his bones are contained. Not there. We can know Jesus from historical evidence. We can know Jesus by faith, that is, by rational, reasoned belief. We can know Jesus from the evidence of his resurrection. We can know him as the Son of God, not just a historical figure. You flip over to Colossians chapter 1, and in verse 16, the Apostle Paul tells us all things were created by him, or in him. All things were created that are in heaven and on earth. We can know him as the Son of God, that is, as deity, not merely or not only an historical human. All things were made. Does that mean that Jesus made you? Well, in a roundabout way, yes. I mean, we have mothers and fathers, and we understand the law of the basic law of procreation, that like produces like, and we know where babies come from, and babies grow into grown people and so forth. But you trace all of it back to the beginning, and what's Paul saying in Colossians 1 and verse 16? Jesus, this historical human figure who was killed and rose again, was also involved in the creation of all things. Who made you? Ultimately, he did. Go to Revelation chapter 1 and verse 8, and there Jesus is described as what? I am the A and the Z, or the Alpha and the Omega. First and last letters of the alphabet in the Greek language, the beginning and the end. Or the beginner and the ender of all things. The start and the finish. Go back to Philippians and look at chapter 2, and in verse 6, Jesus was in the form of God. He was. What do we know about the form of God? God is a spirit. Jesus told the woman at the well of Sychar in John chapter 4, God is a spirit. Those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. God's natural form, as it were, is to be a spiritual, we might say celestial being, not a physical being per se. But continue on in Philippians 2 and verse 7, what happens? Jesus, in the form of God, did what? He took on flesh and was found in the likeness or in the form of humanity. He took on a human existence, something that he had not previously done. So, in conversation with Nicodemus, what does Jesus tell that worthy man? God so loved the world, humanity, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish but have everlasting life. In taking on human form, Jesus willingly became what? man, the only begotten, the only one made like him, God in the flesh, God in human form. Go back to Matthew chapter 1, and in verse 21, thou shalt call his name Joshua, Yoshua, Yesu, in English, Jesus. Why? Why that name? Because it means Savior. He shall save his people from their sins. Save his people from their sins. Skip down to verse 23. His name shall be called Emmanuel. Well, what does that word mean? God with us. God amongst us, as Jerry Clower might have expressed it. God with us. Go to John chapter 3 and verse 17, and there, what do we learn? God, the Father that is, did not send his Son into the world to do what? He did not send the Son to condemn the world, but to save it. But that the world through him might be saved, redeemed, reconciled, brought back into a right relationship with the Father. What do we read about him in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15? We, Christians, do not have a high priest who cannot identify with, cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. What kind of a high priest do we have? We do have a high priest. Our high priest has been tempted in every way, in all points, just like us. He's experienced all of the temptations that we've experienced. He knows what life in this world is like. Go over to Matthew chapter 4 and verse 1, and there we read about the beginnings of what you might call the face-off or the face-to-face confrontation after 40 days of fasting between the Son and the adversary. After 40 days, he took him into the wilderness. He was led into the wilderness by the Spirit for what purpose? Temptation. To be tempted by the devil. To experience what we experience. Go over to Hebrews chapter 5 and look at verses 8 and 9. And just before you do that, ask yourself, have you ever been tempted? Of course. We all experience temptation. How pleasant is it? Well, when you know what you ought to do, and what you ought to do, and what you want to do are diametric opposites, sometimes temptation is not fun, not pleasant, because you have a conscience and you know the right thing to do. By the way, what does James tell us about that? In James chapter 4, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. The one who knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it, not good. It's sin. So you look at Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8, even though Jesus in human form is the Son of God, what did he experience? Though he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect. Stop there for just a second. Does that mean that Jesus was not perfect, not flawless, not sinless until he suffered? No. That word that's translated perfect in our English Bibles The Greek root means complete, mature, full grown. Being made perfect in the sense of having experienced everything that needed to be experienced and triumphed over temptation. Being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So, he learned obedience firsthand by the things that he experienced, the things that he suffered. If he's our role model, what does that mean we need to learn in the face of temptation? We too need to obey the Father through the things that we experience. Go over to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8. We looked at verse 6, he was in the form of God, spirit. Verse 7, he took on human form, flesh. Look at verse 8, and what does Paul tell us there? He became obedient even unto death. Even the death of the cross. Question. Hebrews 9 and verse 27 says it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. In other words, as long as time stands, people are going to go on dying. So assuming that time continues for a while longer, every one of us is going to die. How do you want to die? Sally says, in my sleep. Farion says, in the Lord. Okay, in the Lord. Let's be technical and material about it. How do you want to die in terms of the manner of your departure? Quickly, he says. Get it over with. There is a reward. Okay, who wants to be crucified? If that's what it takes, yes, but I would rather not. It takes a while to die that way. Anybody here up for asphyxiation or strangulation? How about infection? Cancer, anyone? Emphysema? Brutal murder? Well, at least that's usually quick. Drowning? Okay, Hugh comes back to it. Dying in the Lord means escape from this world. The manner really doesn't matter. Anybody want to burn to death? I'll pass.
I love what it says about Stephen.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Acts chapter 7 says of Stephen as he was being stoned that ultimately he fell asleep. He died, but it describes it as falling asleep. Here's the point. Jesus became obedient unto death. Even, Paul says, the death of the cross. In the ancient world, there was no more wretched, ignominious, shameful, horrible, suffering way to die than by crucifixion. Do you know that crucifixion was forbidden for Roman citizens except in extreme circumstances? Roman citizens, the Apostle Paul, in being executed, would not have been crucified. They were allowed to be swiftly beheaded with a sword. A quick and, relatively speaking, painless, because it's over quickly, manner of death. Jesus was willing to to do this, even if it was the slowest, most agonizing form of death known to man. Well, our time is up, so we'll stop at this point with Jesus' obedience unto death and come back and talk a little bit more next week about evidences for faith in Jesus Christ. Thank you for your attention and your participation.